The morning the track stopped. At 6:17 in the morning on December 5, 1941, near a snow-choked road west of Moscow, a Soviet anti-tank rifleman lay with his cheek pressed into frozen earth and waited for the sound to become close enough to kill him. His name may not have survived in the records. Many names did not. In the winter fighting before Moscow, whole companies disappeared into reports written in stiff military language. Position held, enemy repelled, losses heavy. But in that hour, the man behind the rifle would not have been thinking about history. He would have been thinking about the weight of the weapon in front of him, the sting of cold in his fingers, and the heavy metallic clatter moving toward him through the gray light. The rifle was almost as long as his body. A Soviet 14.5mm anti-tank rifle. PTRD or PTRS, depending on the unit, the supply line, the luck of assignment. It was not elegant. It was not quick. It did not look like the kind of weapon that could stop a modern armored attack. It looked like an oversized rifle from a harsher age, a desperate answer to a problem that should have belonged to artillery, mines, or tanks. The German crews coming down the road had reason to believe the same thing. Their engines were rough in the cold. Exhaust hung low behind them. The tracks bit into snow and old mud, grinding over ice, stones, broken branches, and the remains of earlier fighting. Somewhere behind the first vehicle, infantry moved in scattered shapes, keeping close but not too close. The German advance was no longer the clean armored movement imagined on maps months earlier. The road to Moscow had become narrow, frozen, and mean. Still, the tanks moved, and movement was everything. The Soviet riflemen waited. That was the hardest part. Not firing. Waiting. Fire too soon, and the round might strike at a poor angle and vanish in a useless flash. Fire too late, and the tank might already be on top of him. The weapon was powerful for a rifle, but it was still not a field gun. It demanded nerve. It demanded range. It demanded that a man with no armor allow a machine covered in armor to come close enough for the weak points to matter. The assistant beside him, if he had one, would have been watching the road through smoke and snow. Perhaps he whispered the distance. Perhaps he said nothing. In those moments, men often did not speak unless they had to. The noise did enough talking for everyone. Engine knock, track slap, the faint rattle of loose metal, the dull concussion of artillery somewhere behind the trees. Then the rifleman saw what he had been waiting for. Not the front plate, not the proud face of the machine. Lower. The track. A tank was more than armor. It was motion, and motion depended on parts that could break. He pulled the trigger. The shot did not sound like a normal rifle shot. It cracked the morning open, sharp and violent. A hard metallic report that seemed too large for one man. Snow jumped from the ground. The rifle kicked back into his shoulder. For 1 second, nothing changed. Then the German vehicle lurched. Not destroyed. Not consumed by flame. Not thrown into the air like propaganda art. It simply changed rhythm. The track bit wrong, dragged, complained, and the vehicle slowed in the road. Behind it, the column compressed. Men shouted. Another vehicle shifted position. A machine gun began to search the snow line. The rifleman had not won the battle. He had done something more dangerous. He had made the armored column notice him. German crews had believed that a rifle could not decide the movement of steel. They had believed that anti-tank rifles were becoming relics, weapons of the last war trying to survive into a new one. And in many ways, they were not foolish to think that. Armor was growing thicker. Guns were growing larger. The age of the small-caliber anti-tank rifle seemed to be closing almost as soon as the Soviet Union began handing them out in huge numbers. But the Eastern Front did not judge weapons only by what they were supposed to do. It judged them by what happened in mud, snow, smoke, and panic. A tank did not need to explode to become a problem. A track did not need to be completely torn away to slow an attack. A commander did not need to be killed to become blind. A column did not need to be annihilated to lose the few minutes that mattered. That morning, the rifleman in the snow was not trying to prove a theory. He was trying to live long enough to fire again. And behind the first disabled vehicle, the German formation began to discover the truth that would follow these weapons across the Eastern Front. The rifle they mocked did not have to defeat the tank. It only had to break the movement. But to understand why that mattered, we have to look at what German armor believed about itself before the road to Moscow froze beneath its tracks. Armor was momentum. German armor doctrine was built around movement. Not just speed in the simple sense. Movement with purpose. Movement that cut roads, broke lines, crossed rivers before defenders were ready, and forced enemy commanders to make decisions with bad information and no time. A tank column was not merely a collection of vehicles. It was pressure given steel shape. Radios, engines, crews, fuel trucks, infantry, artillery, repair units, maps, signals, timing. All of it had to move together. When it worked, it was terrifying. A defensive line might still exist on paper while German armor was already behind it. A commander might believe he was holding a village while his communications had already been cut. A soldier in a trench might hear engines behind him and understand, before anyone told him, that the battle had changed. This was the world in which many German crews judged the Soviet anti-tank rifle. To them, the weapon looked small in the wrong way. It was large enough to be awkward for the man carrying it, but not large enough to belong to the class of weapons tank crews truly feared. It did not have the blast of an anti-tank gun. It did not have the hidden patience of a mine. It did not have the dramatic threat of a field gun waiting behind a hedgerow or at the end of a village street. It was a rifle. An enormous rifle, yes. A brutal rifle. But still a rifle. And by 1941, many soldiers understood that the age of the anti-tank rifle was already under pressure. In the years before the war, such weapons had seemed logical. Tanks had often been lighter, thinner, more vulnerable. A high-velocity, armor-piercing round could punch through enough metal to make the idea attractive. Give infantry a weapon they could carry. Give them a way to resist armor without waiting for artillery. Give them something cheaper and more available than a dedicated gun. But war moves faster than design offices. Armor thickened. Vehicles changed. The distance between what a weapon promised and what it could actually do began to widen. German tank crews learned to think in categories of danger. Artillery was danger. Mines were danger. Closed assault teams were danger. Anti-tank guns concealed at the edge of a village were danger. A rifle, even a large one, seemed like something that belonged lower on the list. This belief was not pure arrogance. That matters. It is easy, decades later, to say they should have known better. But men at war do not carry hindsight in their pockets. They carry training, rumors, experience, fear, and whatever their commanders have told them often enough to become instinct. A German tank crew that had survived France, Poland, or the first months of the Soviet campaign had seen many threats. They knew what a shell impact felt like. They knew what mines could do. They knew the sound of artillery searching for them. Compared to those things, a rifle seemed almost insulting. And the Soviet riflemen knew this too. They knew the weapon was limited. They knew it was heavy. They knew it would not turn them into tank destroyers in the heroic sense. They knew that against thicker armor, especially from poor angles, their rounds might do nothing visible at all. A shot could spark, ricochet, or bury itself without changing the tank's movement. A man could risk his life, fire perfectly, and still watch the machine continue toward him. This was the cruelty of the weapon. It offered hope, but not certainty. German commanders believed armored movement could overcome scattered infantry resistance. The tank's purpose was to keep the enemy reacting, keep him frightened, keep him late, keep him unable to coordinate. The Soviet anti-tank rifle seemed too small to interrupt that rhythm in a serious way. But the belief contained a hidden assumption, that the only meaningful anti-tank weapon was one that destroyed the tank. The Eastern Front would test that assumption again and again, because a tank attack did not fail only when tanks burned. Could fail when the first vehicle stopped on a narrow road. Could fail when crews buttoned up and lost visibility. Could fail when following vehicles bunched together. Could fail when infantry support hesitated. It could fail when the machine remained alive but no longer moved where it was supposed to move. German doctrine saw armor as momentum. Soviet anti-tank riflemen learned to aim at momentum. They aimed at tracks. They aimed at wheels. They aimed at vision slits when they could. They aimed at side plates, engine compartments, thinly protected vehicles, half-tracks, armored cars, fuel trucks, and anything else that made the armored system work. They understood, often not through formal theory but through dirt-level experience, that a tank was never alone even when it looked alone. A tank was a promise made by logistics. Fuel had to reach it. Ammunition had to reach it. Spare parts had to reach it. Infantry had to move with it. Orders had to arrive. Roads had to remain open. Crews had to see. Tracks had to turn. Break one part and the promise weakened. The German crews who dismissed the anti-tank rifle were not wrong that armor had changed. They were wrong about the kind of damage that mattered. There is a difference between killing a machine and stopping an attack. That difference would become painfully clear in the villages, forests, river crossings, and frozen roads where Soviet rifle teams waited for the steel to come close. But before we follow those men into their positions, we have to understand the machine they were really fighting. Not just the tank, the system beneath it. A tank is more than armor. A tank looks simple from a distance. A dark shape, turret, a gun, tracks smoke, noise. To the infantryman waiting in a ditch, it can feel less like a vehicle than a moving wall. Something without nerves. Something that does not get tired. Something that does not care about fear. But up close, a tank is full of dependencies. It is steel, but not only steel. It is fuel, oil, cables, bolts, bearings, glass, rubber, optics, gears, crew discipline, radio signals, and 1,000 small tolerances that must continue working under conditions that punish every moving part. Mud gets into places designers hoped would stay clean. Ice changes metal. Dust blinds sights. Shell fragments bend things that need to remain straight. Fire turns the inside into an oven. A thrown track can transform a war machine into a bunker with a gun. This was the hidden problem behind the German belief. Armor protection was real. No serious soldier denied it. A rifleman firing at the thick front of a well-positioned tank was asking too much from his weapon. Even the Soviet 14.5mm round, powerful by rifle standards, could not magically erase the advance of armor technology. Against later, heavier German vehicles, the limitations became even more severe. But tanks did not present perfect angles in perfect conditions. They turned. They climbed. They crossed ditches. They moved through villages. They exposed their sides. They entered streets where rubble changed the line of fire. They slowed on roads already damaged by shelling. They relied on lighter vehicles and infantry around them. And they had tracks. The track was not a minor detail. It was the difference between threat and obstacle. A tank with a damaged gun might still withdraw. A tank with a wounded commander might still move. But a tank that lost mobility in the wrong place became a problem for everyone. It blocked roads. It forced recovery. It attracted artillery. It forced following vehicles to maneuver around it, sometimes under fire, sometimes into mud, sometimes into mines. That is why Soviet anti-tank riflemen were trained, where doctrine and experience allowed, not simply to imagine the tank as a single armored box. They were taught to look for weakness. Side armor, rear armor, observation devices, turret rings, engine areas, road wheels, tracks vehicles that were not tanks but mattered almost as much. Armored cars, half-tracks, tractors, ammunition carriers, trucks, motorcycles with sidecars, command vehicles. The German tank crew might have seen the anti-tank rifle as a poor answer to armor. The Soviet infantrymen saw it as one of the few answers available to everything armor needed. That distinction mattered. On the Eastern Front, roads could be narrow and unreliable. A single disabled vehicle could create confusion far beyond its own importance. If the column had to stop, it lost the protection of motion. If commanders had to button up, they saw less. If infantry had to spread out to clear concealed riflemen, the pace changed. If repair crews had to approach a damaged track under fire, the tank's armor no longer protected the men needed to restore movement. The rifleman did not have to solve the whole battle. He had to create friction. Friction is one of war's quiet rulers. It hides inside every plan. On a map, arrows move easily. On the ground, men slip, engines stall, roads vanish, bridges collapse, radios fail, and a single unexpected shot can force a commander to spend time he does not have. The anti-tank rifle was a weapon of friction. The sound alone could change behavior. A tank commander who heard armor-piercing rounds striking nearby might close hatches. Once buttoned up, he was safer but less aware. He could no longer read the battlefield with the same speed. He relied more heavily on periscopes, slits, shouted commands, and radio messages. Every second lost in perception gave defenders a chance to reposition, to bring up a gun, to throw smoke, to retreat, or to aim again. And the men firing these rifles understood something that many larger systems often forgot. War is not decided only by the most powerful weapon. It is also decided by the weapon that is present. An anti-tank gun might be better, but it might be destroyed. A tank might be ideal, but it might be somewhere else. Artillery might be decisive, but the wire might be cut or the observer dead. In those moments, the anti-tank rifle became not a theoretical weapon but a practical one. It was there, could fire, could hurt something. That was enough to keep it in the hands of men who had few choices left. The German belief had been shaped by comparison. Rifle versus armor. On that scale, the rifle looked weak. Battlefield reality used a different comparison. Rifle versus track, rifle versus optics, rifle versus fuel truck, rifle versus delay. On that scale, the weapon became more dangerous. But danger on paper meant nothing until someone carried it forward. And the men who carried it were rarely the men featured in grand histories of armored war. They were not famous commanders. They were not aces. They were not generals standing over maps. They were riflemen in snow, mud, and ruins, told to wait until the machine came near enough for fear to become useful. Their story begins not in the factory or the design bureau, but in the ditch beside the road. The men behind the long rifles. The Soviet anti-tank rifle team did not look like a unit that could change the behavior of armored forces. Usually there were two men. Sometimes one if the battle had taken the other. One carried or fired the rifle. The other helped with ammunition, spotting, movement, and survival. The weapon was long, heavy, and awkward in the worst possible way. Too important to abandon, too large to carry easily under fire, too loud to hide after firing. A soldier could learn the mechanism. He could learn where to aim. He could learn how to brace himself against the recoil. But no training manual could remove the moment when he had to remain still while a tank approached. That moment belonged to the body, the throat drying, the hands tightening, the urge to fire early, the strange narrowing of the world until there was only a moving track, a patch of side armor, a vision slit, a wheel, a line of sight that appeared and disappeared through smoke. The assistant might be young enough to still have a boy's face under the dirt. He might carry ammunition wrapped in cloth to keep snow and grit away from it. He might watch the flanks because a rifleman staring at a tank could easily miss the German infantry moving behind it. He might be the one who whispered, "Wait," or he might be the one who grabbed the gunner's sleeve when the machine gun began cutting through the brush. No one in such a position felt like a hero. That word comes later, if it comes at all. In the moment, the anti-tank rifleman was a man asked to do something almost unreasonable. Let the enemy's armor close the distance. The rifle's chance of meaningful effect improved at shorter ranges and better angles. That meant patience. And patience under armor is not calm. It is controlled panic. The weapon itself added to the punishment. The PTRD was a single-shot weapon, simpler and rugged, but each round had to be loaded with deliberate movement. The PTRS, semi-automatic, offered faster fire but brought its own complications of weight and mechanism. Both fired the large 14.5mm cartridge, a round that made ordinary rifle ammunition seem small by comparison. This power came with blast, recoil, and signature. Once fired, it told the battlefield where the team might be. A shot could bring machine gun fire in seconds. This is why anti-tank rifle teams had to think like hunters and fugitives at the same time. Choose a position. Fire. Move if possible. Use terrain. Use smoke. Use the noise of battle. Aim not where pride wanted to aim, but where the machine was vulnerable. And always remember that the tank was not the only threat. Infantry followed. Artillery listened. Mortars waited. A tank that could not see you might still shoot the entire treeline until nothing in it moved. The men who carried these rifles were part of a broader Soviet answer to catastrophe. In 1941, the Red Army had lost enormous quantities of equipment. Anti-tank guns were not always where they were needed. Units were reorganizing under pressure. Factories were moving east. Men were arriving at the front with training that varied from adequate to painfully thin. The need for portable anti-armor weapons was not academic. It was immediate, so the anti-tank rifle became a tool of necessity. Not because it was perfect, because it could be made, issued, carried, and fired. That practical quality shaped the men who used it. They were not specialists in the romantic sense. Many were ordinary infantrymen forced into a specialized terror. Their courage was not clean. It was mixed with exhaustion, fear, obedience, anger, and the knowledge that if they failed, the tanks would not stop for anyone's reasons. Some of them became very good. They learned to read movement. A tank slowing before a ditch. A driver turning slightly to avoid a crater. A side exposed for half a second. A half-track following too close behind the lead vehicle. A crew opening a hatch for visibility. A track already loose from road conditions. A support truck whose destruction might matter more than a dramatic shot against frontal armor. Experience taught them what doctrine could only sketch. And experience also taught them what the weapon could not do. That was important. The best riflemen did not believe in magic. They knew that some German vehicles would shrug off poor hits. They knew that angle mattered. They knew that the battlefield could swallow their shots without reward. They knew that a tank might keep coming even after they had done everything right. The German crews mocked the rifle because they judged it from inside armor. The Soviet riflemen judged it from the ground, where even a small chance could be worth carrying if the alternative was waiting helplessly. In the end, the anti-tank rifle did not make ordinary men invincible. It made them responsible for a small, terrifying possibility. A track might break. A driver might flinch. A column might stop. A few minutes might be gained. And in war, a few minutes can become the difference between a line collapsing and a line holding long enough for something heavier to arrive. But weapons born from necessity often carry another burden. They are asked to do more than they should. They are pushed into roles that expose their limits. And on the Eastern Front, the Soviet anti-tank rifle would soon face its cruelest test. Not in theory, not on a range, but under the first full pressure of German armor moving toward men who could not retreat. Stop a tank with a rifle. To many soldiers, the idea sounded almost foolish when said plainly. Stop a tank with a rifle. Not a field gun. Not a minefield. Not another tank waiting hull down behind a ridge. A rifle. A long one, a heavy one, a violent one, but still a weapon held by a man whose body remained entirely vulnerable to the machine he was ordered to attack. It was the kind of idea that becomes believable only when the alternatives have already been stripped away. The Soviet Union did not embrace the anti-tank rifle because it had discovered a perfect answer to German armor. It embraced it because war had become an emergency measured in factories, rail lines, missing guns, lost vehicles, and infantry divisions trying to rebuild faster than they were being consumed. In 1941, the Red Army was fighting not just the Wehrmacht but the consequences of disaster. Equipment had been lost in enormous quantities during the opening months of the invasion. Units were shattered, reformed, and thrown back into combat. Industrial production was under strain. Whole factories were uprooted and moved eastward, away from the advancing front. Every weapon that could be produced quickly mattered. The anti-tank rifle fit that terrible logic. It was simpler than a gun. It required less than a tank. It could be issued to infantry in numbers that heavier systems could not match. It could move where horses, trucks, and gun crews struggled. It could be hidden in a trench, behind a wall, inside a ruined building, along a forest road, or in snow beside a track. It gave infantry something. That word is small, but in war it can be everything. Something to fire when armor appeared. Something to threaten lighter vehicles. Something to damage a track. Something to make a tank commander close his hatch. Something to tell a soldier that he was not entirely waiting to be crushed. The Soviet command understood both the promise and the limitation. The rifle was not meant to replace artillery. It could not do the work of all anti-tank defense. In a proper defensive system, it belonged with mines, guns, obstacles, infantry, artillery, and terrain. But proper systems were not always available. The Eastern Front often produced ugly situations where a weapon's theoretical role mattered less than whether it could be brought to the place where men were about to die. For the men who carried it, the absurdity never disappeared. A tank's gun could smash a building. Its machine guns could rake a trench. Its armor gave its crew a kind of separation from the ordinary vulnerability of infantry. The rifleman had no such separation. If he misjudged the distance, he might waste his shot. If he fired from the wrong position, he might be killed before reloading. If he stayed too long, German infantry might find him. Yet men used these weapons again and again because the battlefield rewarded anything that created hesitation. A tank attack is not only a matter of machines moving forward. It is a chain of confidence. The lead vehicles trust that the road is passable. The following vehicles trust that the lead vehicles will not suddenly block them. The infantry trust that the tanks will suppress enemy positions. The commander trusts that momentum will make the defender react too late. The anti-tank rifle attacked that confidence at close range. It made the crew wonder what else was hidden in the ditch. If a rifle was firing from the snowline, perhaps a minefield was nearby. Perhaps an anti-tank gun was waiting farther back. Perhaps artillery observers were watching the same road. The weapon's physical damage could be limited, but the psychological effect belonged to a larger pattern of danger. German soldiers were not cowards because they reacted to it. They were professionals responding to uncertainty. A tank crew that ignored close-range anti-tank fire risked losing vision, mobility, or support. A commander who dismissed every rifle shot as harmless might find his column stopped by the one hit that mattered. The Soviet rifleman lived inside that possibility. He did not need German respect. He needed one moment of mechanical failure. There is a harsh honesty in that. The anti-tank rifle was not a miracle. It did not erase German advantages. It did not save every village. It did not make Soviet losses less terrible. It was a weapon of narrow chances, and narrow chances often demand the most from the people asked to take them. This is where the story becomes less about technology and more about the moral pressure placed on ordinary soldiers. A rifle designed to give infantry agency also asked them to expose themselves in ways that bordered on sacrifice. The command could issue the weapon. The factory could produce it. The manual could describe the weak points. But only the man in the ditch could decide when to pull the trigger. And once he fired, theory ended. The round either struck something that mattered, or it did not. The tank either slowed, or it kept coming. The position either survived the return fire, or it vanished under it. That was the test. Not whether the anti-tank rifle looked modern. Not whether German crews respected it in advance. Not whether its statistics satisfied a clean comparison with armor thickness. The test was whether, under fire, in bad ground, at close range, a weapon many had dismissed could interrupt the forward movement of men and machines that believed they still held the initiative. Soon, that question would be answered in the only place armies truly accept answers. On the battlefield. The test under fire. The road was never as wide as it looked on the map. On the map, it was a line. Clean, useful, almost obedient. It crossed fields, bent past a village, disappeared into a patch of forest, and emerged toward the next objective. Commander could place arrows on it. A staff officer could calculate movement along it. A tank column could be assigned to it. But on the ground, the road was rutted, frozen at the edges, broken by shell craters, narrowed by abandoned carts, and bordered by places where men could hide. That was where the Soviet anti-tank rifle team waited. The gunner had chosen a position low enough to break his outline. Perhaps behind a snowbank. Perhaps inside a ruined shed with half the wall gone. Perhaps in a shallow scrape covered with branches. The assistant lay beside him with ammunition close enough to reach without lifting his body too high. They had been told where to aim. Tracks if the front armor was poor. Side armor if the angle allowed. Vision slits if the vehicle slowed. Lighter vehicles if tanks proved too hard. Anything that carried fuel, men, ammunition, or command. The first German vehicle came into view through smoke. It is tempting to imagine that the rifleman felt clarity. Men in documentaries often seem to possess it. The clean moment, the perfect target, the calm breath. Real battle was rarely that generous. The tank moved behind drifting smoke. Infantry shapes appeared and disappeared. Snow and dirt jumped where artillery had struck earlier. The gunner's eyes watered from cold and strain. His shoulder ached before the first shot. The assistant tried to judge distance while keeping his head down. A machine gun fired somewhere to their right, and for a second neither man knew whether they had been seen. The tank closed. The gunner waited. The lead vehicle was not presenting the target he wanted. Its front was angled, its movement uneven, its gun searching. A shot too high might do nothing. A shot too early might announce their position before the chance came. Behind it, a second vehicle slowed near the bend in the road. For one moment, its side showed through the smoke. The assistant touched the gunner's sleeve. Now, the rifle fired. The blast was enormous in the small space. Dust, frost, and splinters shook loose around them. The gunner felt the recoil through his shoulder and jaw. He did not know where the round had gone. No one ever knows in the first fraction after firing. The battlefield keeps its answer for a moment. Then metal rang. The German vehicle kept moving. The assistant reached for another round. That was the part often missing from clean stories of war. Failure inside courage. A brave shot could still fail. A good weapon could still strike badly. A man could do what he was trained to do and receive nothing in return but the need to try again before the enemy found him. The second round went lower. This time the hit was different. A flash near the running gear. A hard snap of impact. The vehicle did not explode. It did not rear up. It staggered in the mechanical way vehicles do when something beneath them has gone wrong. One track seemed to drag. The driver tried to correct. The tank slewed slightly, grinding into the road edge. Behind it, the column reacted. That was the real effect. The following vehicle slowed. Infantry dropped. A German machine gun began to rake the suspected position. The first burst passed high. The second struck closer, cutting into timber and frozen ground. The assistant flinched but did not leave. The gunner tried to pull the weapon back, but the rifle was long and clumsy, and the earth around them offered little room. Another Soviet weapon opened from somewhere farther down the line. Then a mortar. Then rifles. The disabled vehicle had become a marker, a point around which the battle reorganized itself. German attention shifted. Soviet defenders had gained seconds. Then perhaps a minute. Then perhaps enough time for another weapon to fire. This was how the anti-tank rifle often mattered. Not as a single dramatic instrument, but as part of a sudden knot of violence. One shot damaged mobility. Another forced hatches closed. A third struck a lighter vehicle. German infantry had to clear the area. Tanks had to suppress positions. The advance lost its clean line. What had been movement became work. And work under fire is slow. The rifle team tried to move after firing. That was doctrine if the terrain allowed. But moving with such a weapon was not graceful. The assistant grabbed ammunition. The gunner dragged the rifle backward through snow and dirt. A shell landed behind them, close enough to push air into their bodies. For a moment, the gunner could not hear properly. His world became pressure, ringing metal, and the taste of soil in his mouth. When sound returned, the tank was still there. Stopped. Not dead. Not defeated in the grand sense. But no longer doing what it had come to do. For the German crew inside, the experience was different but no less real. They had felt the strike. Perhaps not a mortal blow, but enough to change the atmosphere inside the vehicle. A tank interior was cramped, loud, hot or freezing depending on the season, full of vibration and shouted fragments. The crew did not enjoy omniscience. If the vehicle lurched, if a track dragged, if vision narrowed, they had to interpret danger through noise. Was it a mine? A rifle? A gun? Were more shots coming? Was the road covered? Was infantry support close enough? The anti-tank rifle had entered their decision-making. That was its victory. German armor had believed it could measure the rifle by penetration alone. But under fire, measurement became more complicated. A tank that slowed became a target. A commander who hesitated lost initiative. A crew that buttoned up saw less. A column that compressed became vulnerable to weapons that had not yet fired. The rifle team had not defeated German armor. They had forced German armor to deal with them. And in a battle where every minute was contested, that difference could be enough. But once the first vehicle stopped, the danger did not end. It widened, because a disabled tank on a road was not just a damaged machine. It was a trap for everyone around it. A disabled tank is a trap. A burning tank draws the eye. Flames rise. Ammunition cooks off. Smoke marks the place for everyone on the battlefield. It is dramatic, terrible, and easy to understand. A destroyed tank looks like victory. A disabled tank is quieter. At first, it may look almost intact. The gun may still traverse. The crew may still be alive. The engine may still run. From a distance, the machine may seem dangerous enough to command respect. But if its track is broken, if its running gear is damaged, if it cannot move from the road where it stopped, then its meaning has changed. It is no longer only a weapon. It is an obstruction. On the Eastern Front, obstruction could be deadly. Roads mattered. Firm ground mattered. Bridges mattered. A tank column could not always spread out elegantly across open country. Mud, snow, forest, mines, drainage ditches, shell craters, and villages forced vehicles into predictable paths. When the lead vehicle stopped in one of those paths, the entire movement behind it had to answer a new question. Go around? Reverse? Wait? Recover it? Push past? Send infantry forward? Bring up engineers? Call artillery? Smoke the area? Find the rifle team? Assume mines? Assume guns? Every answer cost time. And time was what the anti-tank rifle had been trying to steal. A German commander looking at a halted vehicle did not have the luxury of treating it as a minor inconvenience. If the road was blocked, the attack's rhythm changed. If following vehicles bunched together, they became better targets. If infantry moved forward to clear the flanks, they entered the zone where Soviet small arms, mortars, and machine guns could do their work. If crews opened hatches to inspect damage, they became vulnerable. If they stayed buttoned up, they saw less. The Soviet riflemen understood this because they lived at the level where such details decided survival. A broken track meant the tank had stopped in a place someone else had chosen. That mattered. Armored doctrine wanted movement on its own terms. Defensive fire tried to take those terms away. The anti-tank rifle was one of the tools that could do it, not always reliably, not always decisively, but often enough to demand attention. This was the central reversal. German crews had believed that because anti-tank rifles struggled against improved armor, they were fading from relevance. But the Eastern Front showed that relevance was not the same as spectacular destruction. A weapon could be limited and still dangerous, could fail against one target and cripple another. It could lose importance against heavy tanks and remain deadly against half-tracks, armored cars, trucks, and exposed components. It could be obsolete in one role and useful in another. Battlefield reality does not care about categories. It cares about what happens next. When a German vehicle stopped under fire, recovery itself became combat. Repairing a track in training was one thing. Repairing it near a Soviet defensive line was another. A crewman outside the tank was just a man in the open. Engineers and recovery vehicles had to approach. Infantry had to provide cover. Smoke might be needed. Artillery might be called. The battlefield began consuming resources around a single damaged machine. That was the hidden cost of a rifle shot. Not merely the track link. Not merely the repair time. The cost was attention. The cost was exposure. The cost was hesitation spreading backward through the column. Inside the German vehicle, the crew might have felt frustration more than fear at first. A hard jolt. A warning light if the vehicle had one relevant to the problem. A shouted report from the driver. The commander trying to see through limited optics. the gunner waiting for a target he could not clearly identify. The radio alive with clipped voices, some calm, some less so. Outside, Soviet defenders watched for the next opportunity. An immobilized tank could still kill. No one forgot that. This gun could tear apart a house. Its machine guns could punish movement. Its armor could keep the crew alive long enough to fight. But the initiative had shifted. The machine that had arrived as part of an attack now had to defend itself, explain itself, and be dealt with by its own side. And if Soviet artillery observers were alive, the stopped vehicle became a coordinate. If sappers were nearby, it became an opportunity. If infantry had grenades, Molotov cocktails, mines, or simply the courage to crawl closer under cover, it became a problem that could grow worse. The anti-tank rifle was often the beginning of that chain, not the end. This is why German respect for the weapon did not require admiration. It required adaptation. Crews learned to be wary of close terrain. Infantry support mattered. Hatches stayed closed more often under threat, reducing visibility. Light vehicles could not assume they were safe simply because no anti-tank gun had revealed itself. Roadsides, ruins, tree lines, and snowbanks became suspect. The rifle had changed the mental map. That may sound abstract until one imagines being inside a tank approaching a village where every broken window might hide a 14.5mm barrel. The crew might still believe their armor could survive. They might be right, but they could not know which shot would find the track, which would crack an optic, which would strike a companion vehicle, which would reveal a larger ambush. Confidence became calculation. Calculation slowed movement. And movement was the heart of German armored warfare. This did not make the anti-tank rifle a war-winning weapon by itself. Nothing about the Eastern Front was that simple. The Red Army paid heavily. Many riflemen died. Many shots failed. Many German tanks continued through fire that would have terrified any man outside them. But the belief that the rifle did not matter because it could not always destroy a tank was too narrow. War is full of narrow beliefs punished by wide realities. The German track stopped on the road was one of those punishments. To understand how such small interruptions could matter across a front so vast, we have to leave the single road and look at the arithmetic of survival, the cold mathematics that made a crude weapon worth carrying even when its limits were obvious. The mathematics of survival. Numbers can make war seem cleaner than it is. Penetration figure, a range, production total, caliber, a thickness of armor in millimeters. These things matter. Men died because one number was larger than another. Plate too thick, a shell too slow, a range too long, a bridge too weak, a fuel reserve too small. But numbers become dangerous when they pretend to explain everything. The Soviet anti-tank rifle is often judged by one number above all others. Whether its round could penetrate a given thickness of armor at a given distance. That number matters. It tells us why the weapon was more effective against early war and lighter vehicles, and why its usefulness declined against heavier German tanks. It explains why no serious account should pretend that anti-tank riflemen were casually destroying every armored vehicle they saw. But the battlefield used more than one number. There was the number of rifles that could be produced and issued, the number of infantry units that could receive at least some anti-armor capability, the number of roads where a light vehicle could be threatened, the number of minutes a column might lose if the lead vehicle stopped, the number of men forced to dismount, the number of hatches closed after rounds struck nearby, the number of support trucks damaged before they reached the front. A weapon's value is sometimes hidden in the numbers that do not appear in dramatic summaries. Consider the cost of movement. A German armored formation did not consist only of tanks. It required supply vehicles, maintenance crews, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, signals, medical support, and recovery assets. Many of those elements were more vulnerable than the tanks themselves. A 14.5mm round that failed to destroy a medium tank might still be devastating against a truck, an armored car, a half-track, or equipment exposed at the wrong angle. The anti-tank rifle allowed Soviet infantry to reach into the softer parts of the armored system. That mattered because logistics does not have armor everywhere. Fuel trucks do not inspire the same fear as tanks, but without fuel the tank becomes a monument. Ammunition carriers do not dominate battlefield paintings, but without ammunition the gun becomes decoration. Recovery crews do not appear in heroic charges, but without them damaged tanks remain where they stopped. The rifleman understood none of this in a staff college way while lying in the snow. He did not need to. He knew that if the target in front of him could be damaged, it was worth firing. He knew that a vehicle stopped on the road might slow the others. He knew that a German soldier forced to crawl under a machine with tools in his hand was easier to kill than a tank moving at speed. The mathematics of survival were not elegant. A rifle team might fire and miss. It might fire and reveal itself. It might fire and achieve only a spark on armor. But if enough teams were distributed across enough threatened sectors, the probability of inconvenience became a real military factor. Not certainty, pressure. War often turns on pressure. One defender cannot cover every approach. 10 defenders can make a road feel watched. 100 rifles across a division's frontage can create a different kind of terrain. Terrain made not of hills and rivers, but of possible shots. A German crew did not need to be destroyed by every rifle to respect the possibility that one of them might hit something important. This is why cheap weapons can have expensive effects. The rifle was not cheap for the man carrying it. It cost him strength, speed, and perhaps his life. But compared to a tank, compared to a gun, compared to the industrial burden of armored warfare, it represented a way to distribute danger widely. It allowed Soviet infantry to impose small risks in many places. Small risks accumulate. A damaged track here. A delayed vehicle there. A half-track abandoned under fire. A commander forced to button up. A repair crew pinned down. A column slowed long enough for artillery to adjust. None of these moments alone looks like a decisive battle. Together, they create friction. And friction is how grand plans become human problems. There is also the number no one can measure cleanly: hesitation. How many seconds did a German commander lose because the road ahead looked suspicious? How many meters did infantry advance more cautiously because anti-tank rifle fire had come from the last tree line? How many times did a tank crew close a hatch and lose a glimpse of the battlefield at the wrong moment? How many attacks slowed not because of destruction, but because the defenders had made the next step feel uncertain? Military history can count burned vehicles more easily than delayed decisions. But delayed decisions matter. The Soviet anti-tank rifle lived in that difficult space between tactical damage and psychological pressure. It did not always deliver visible proof. It did not always give commanders a clean statistic. Yet its presence shaped behavior. It forced German armor to acknowledge that infantry without guns was not always helpless. It reminded crews that machines are built from parts, and parts can fail. Still, numbers cannot carry the whole story. A chart can explain why the weapon was issued. Cannot explain what it felt like to drag it through snow while artillery walked closer. A production figure can show why commanders valued it. It cannot show the assistant's hands shaking as he pushed another round toward the gunner. A penetration table can clarify what the weapon could do. Cannot explain the sound inside a man's chest when the tank he has fired at keeps coming. The mathematics of survival justified the anti-tank rifle. The human cost made that justification painful. And to see that cost, we have to return from numbers to the ground, to the men who paid for each chance with distance, exposure, and fear. The cost of waiting too close. The anti-tank rifle demanded closeness. That was its cruelty. A soldier with artillery could sometimes fight from distance. A tank crew at least fought from inside steel. A machine gunner might have a dug position, a field of fire, a weapon suited to his role. But the anti-tank rifleman had to bring an imperfect weapon close to a dangerous target and wait until its imperfections became less fatal. Every meter mattered. At long range, the shot might be wasted. At a bad angle, the round might glance away. Against heavier armor, even a hit might mean little. So the rifleman waited while the tank grew larger, while the sound filled his body, while the ground seemed to tremble beneath his elbows. There is a point in such waiting where training and fear become almost indistinguishable. The man does not feel calm. He feels locked into the act. The rifle is aligned. The target is moving. The assistant is beside him. The command has been given, or perhaps no command is possible now. He has already waited too long to withdraw cleanly. If he fires, he may reveal himself. If he does not fire, the tank may pass over the position or break the line behind him. This was the burden placed on many Soviet anti-tank rifle teams. The weapon gave infantry agency, but agency is not comfort. It is responsibility under threat. The rifleman could act, yes. He could also fail visibly, immediately, and at close range. After the shot, survival became even harder. The muzzle blast could betray the position. Snow or dust might leap from the firing point. German infantry, trained and experienced, would search for the source. Tank machine guns could sweep likely hiding places. Mortars could follow. Artillery could erase a tree line not because every defender had been seen, but because enough danger had come from that direction. The rifle team had to move if possible. But movement was a punishment of its own. The weapon was long. Ammunition was heavy. Wounded men could not carry it far. In deep snow or mud, repositioning took strength that hunger and cold had already stolen. In ruins, the barrel snagged on broken timber. In trenches, it was awkward to turn. In forest, branches betrayed motion. If the assistant was hit, the gunner lost more than companionship. He lost extra hands, extra eyes, extra ammunition, perhaps the voice that had been judging distance while he stared down the sights. If the gunner was hit, the assistant might try to take over, but under fire there is no smooth transfer of roles. There is only urgency. Some died after successful shots. Some survived failed ones. War does not distribute outcomes according to effort. This is why the anti-tank rifleman story should not be told as simple heroism. Courage was there, certainly, but courage was mixed with coercion, duty, fear, comradeship, exhaustion, and the knowledge that the German attack would not stop because a man felt unready. Soviet soldiers fought in a system that could be harsh to its own men, and they faced an enemy that brought immense violence into their country. Between those realities, individual soldiers made decisions that rarely fit clean moral language. A man might fire because he was brave. He might fire because his friend was beside him. He might fire because he had nowhere to go. He might fire because the road behind him led to a village, a command post, a field hospital, or simply another group of men who needed a few more minutes. The records do not always tell us which reason mattered most. They tell us sometimes that a tank was damaged, that a vehicle was stopped, that an attack was repelled, that a soldier received an award, that a unit held its position. The language becomes compressed. The terror vanishes between the lines. But the body remembers what reports omit. The bruised shoulder after repeated firing. The ringing ears. The taste of powder and dirt. The strange silence after a near explosion. When a man sees mouths moving but cannot hear words. The smell of hot metal and churned earth. The moment of looking at a comrade and realizing he is no longer moving, though the battle has not paused to acknowledge it. German crews paid costs too. A disabled tank was not a safe place. A crew trapped inside an immobilized vehicle under fire faced its own claustrophobic fear. Leaving the tank could mean being shot. Staying inside could mean waiting for artillery, fire, or close assault. The Eastern Front did not grant clean categories of suffering. Men inside armor and men outside it were both caught in systems larger than themselves. But the anti-tank rifleman's vulnerability was especially exposed. He fought armored war with his chest against the ground. That image matters, because it reminds us that technological stories are always human stories in disguise. Caliber, range, armor, production, doctrine, all of them eventually arrive at a person who must do something with shaking hands. A weapon can be designed in a bureau, manufactured in a factory, issued by a quartermaster, and explained in a manual. But its meaning is decided by the man who uses it when the enemy is close enough to see. Many of those men were not remembered individually. Some were folded into unit histories. Some appeared in award citations. Some vanished into casualty lists. Some survived and carried memories that no table of equipment could hold. When the war moved on and heavier weapons took over the anti-tank role, the rifle teams did not become irrelevant in memory because they had failed. They became harder to see because their work was often partial, local, and costly. A tank burned in a photograph is easy to remember. A track broken long enough for a line to hold is harder. Yet for the men in that line, the difference was not abstract. It was life measured in minutes. And those minutes, once bought, were often written down later in language far too small for what they had cost. Reports, medals, and the things left out. After battle, war changes form. The smoke lifts. The wounded are moved if they can be moved. Vehicles are counted. Weapons are collected or abandoned. Officers write reports. Clerks type summaries. Maps are corrected. Losses are estimated, often badly. Success and failure are made to fit the narrow space of official language. A rifle team's experience might become a sentence. Enemy tank damaged. Attack delayed. Anti-tank rifle fire effective against light vehicles. Position held until evening. There is something almost cruel about the efficiency of such language. It is necessary. Armies cannot write poetry for every destroyed wheel or every man who crawled through snow with ammunition under his coat. But necessity does not make it complete. The Soviet anti-tank rifle entered official memory unevenly. In the desperate years of 1941 and 1942, it represented resilience and improvisation. It gave infantry a way to fight armor when other means were scarce. Soviet propaganda and award citations could highlight individual acts of courage. Men who disabled vehicles under fire might be praised, decorated, or held up as examples. But recognition came through the same machinery that simplified everything. The weapons role changed as the war changed. German armor improved. Side armor, frontal protection, and battlefield tactics made the anti-tank rifle less reliable against tanks than it had been against earlier or lighter vehicles. By the time heavier German machines appeared in greater numbers, no serious commander could imagine the anti-tank rifle as the main answer to armored threats. Mines, guns, artillery, assault teams, and later more effective infantry anti-tank weapons became increasingly important. Yet the rifle did not simply vanish from usefulness. It remained dangerous against lighter armor, soft-skinned vehicles, half-tracks, firing slits, exposed equipment, and vulnerable components. It remained a tool for harassment, disruption, and local defense. Could still punish carelessness. Could still make roads dangerous. Could still force respect in close terrain. This made its legacy complicated. Weapons that are clearly triumphant are easy to celebrate. Weapons that clearly fail are easy to dismiss. The anti-tank rifle belongs to a harder category. A weapon whose importance depended on context, timing, target, terrain, and the courage of men using it under conditions where clean success was rare. German reports and battlefield experience reflected that complexity. German crews did not need to fear every anti-tank rifle as a tank killer. But they learned that ignoring them could be costly. Light vehicles were vulnerable. Tracks could be damaged. Optics and external fittings could be struck. Infantry support could not assume that Soviet riflemen without guns were harmless. This is delayed realization in its most practical form. Not a dramatic moment where an entire army suddenly admits it was wrong. Armies rarely do that. Realization comes in smaller ways. A commander changes how he approaches a village. A crew keeps hatches closed longer. Infantry is ordered to clear suspected positions more carefully. Light vehicles hang back. Roadside cover receives more machine gun fire before tanks move forward. A weapon once mocked becomes part of the threat environment. Respect in war often looks like caution. For Soviet commanders, the realization was also sober. The anti-tank rifle was valuable but not sufficient. Could not carry anti-tank defense alone. Its users needed integration with other weapons. They needed terrain. They needed numbers. They needed training. They needed luck. Without those things, bravery could be spent quickly and gain little. Some men were recognized for using the weapon with extraordinary effectiveness. Others were not. The Eastern Front was too vast, too violent, and too administratively overwhelmed to preserve every act. Many riflemen who delayed attacks or damaged vehicles became anonymous parts of larger defensive actions. Their impact was real but difficult to isolate. This is one reason their story matters. Not because every anti-tank rifle shot changed the course of the war. That would be false. Not because the weapon was secretly superior to the guns and tanks that dominated armored combat. That would also be false. It matters because it reveals how war actually works at ground level. A limited tool placed in the hands of ordinary men can still shape events if it attacks the right weakness at the right moment. History often remembers destruction more easily than disruption. But disruption is everywhere in war. A bridge not crossed, a road blocked, a message delayed, a vehicle immobilized, a crew blinded, commander forced to wait. These things rarely create a single iconic photograph, but they decide the shape of battles. The anti-tank rifle lived in those spaces. By the later war, as Soviet industry recovered and the Red Army fielded more powerful means of defeating armor, the rifle's central role diminished. But its lesson did not disappear. Infantry had learned, again and under brutal pressure, that armored machines were not invulnerable objects. They were systems, and systems could be attacked at their weak points. That lesson would outlive the rifle itself. The long barrel, the heavy cartridge, the bruised shoulder, the frozen ditch, these belonged to a particular war and a particular front. But the idea beneath them remained. Do not ask only whether a weapon can destroy the enemy's strongest feature. Ask whether it can damage something the enemy needs in order to keep fighting. The Germans had believed the anti-tank rifle was fading into irrelevance because armor had outgrown it. What they encountered was a battlefield where irrelevance was never decided by armor alone. It was decided by movement, and movement could still be broken. The weapon that taught infantry to aim at systems. By the end of the war, the anti-tank rifle no longer stood at the center of infantry anti-armor imagination. Other weapons had taken that space. Heavier guns, mines, shaped charges, rocket launchers, better coordinated artillery, more powerful tanks. The battlefield had moved on as battlefields always do. A weapon that seems urgent in one year can become inadequate in another. No soldier who faced heavy late-war armor would confuse a 14.5mm rifle with a complete answer. But obsolescence is not the same as meaninglessness. The Soviet anti-tank rifle left behind a lesson more durable than its specific role. It taught infantry to think of armored vehicles not as single invulnerable beasts, but as collections of necessary functions. Movement, vision, communication, fuel, support, recovery, coordination, attack the function and the machine changes. A tank with intact armor but broken mobility has lost part of its purpose. A commander alive but unable to see has lost part of his power. A column full of vehicles but short of fuel is only a traffic problem waiting to happen. A half-track destroyed behind the tanks may matter less in photographs but more in the next hour of fighting. A recovery crew pinned down can be as important as the damage that summoned it. This is the deeper legacy of the anti-tank rifle. It belongs to a family of wartime truths that are easy to miss because they are not glamorous. The most powerful weapon is not always the one that makes the largest explosion. The most important target is not always the thickest armor. The decisive effect is not always destruction. Sometimes the decisive effect is delay, blindness, confusion, or forcing the enemy to protect something he assumed was safe. The rifle was a teacher because it was limited. A perfect weapon can encourage simple thinking. An imperfect weapon forces men to learn. Soviet riflemen had to learn angles, distance, patience, and target selection. They had to understand that a shot wasted against strong frontal armor might be less valuable than a shot against a lighter vehicle behind it. They had to recognize opportunity in partial exposure. They had to accept that survival depended on not only firing, but moving, hiding, and coordinating with other defenders. The weapon punished fantasy. It rewarded practical observation. That practical observation is one of the marks of experienced infantry. Men who live close to the ground often understand machines differently from the men who design them or command them from maps. They see where mud collects. They see where drivers slow down. They see which routes vehicles prefer. They see how crews behave when visibility is poor. They learn the sound of a healthy engine and the sound of one under strain. The anti-tank rifle gave those observations a way to become action. Not always successful action. Not always survivable action. But action. That is why the weapon fits the spirit of Warfront Archive so well. It is not a story of mythic superiority. It is a story of belief colliding with reality. German crews and commanders had reasons to believe the anti-tank rifle was limited. Soviet soldiers had reasons to fear those limits. But the battlefield revealed a narrower, harder truth. Limited weapons can still matter when they are aimed at the part of the enemy's confidence he forgot to protect. The track, the wheel, the slit of glass, the supply truck, the moment of hesitation, the road blocked at the worst possible point. Modern observers sometimes look backward and ask whether the anti-tank rifle was effective. The answer depends on what we mean by effective. If we mean a reliable killer of increasingly heavy German tanks, the answer must be cautious. Its effectiveness declined as armor improved, and it was never a substitute for heavier anti-tank systems. But if we mean a weapon that gave infantry a portable means to damage, delay, harass, and disrupt armored forces across brutal conditions, the answer changes. Effectiveness is not only what burns. It is what stops. It is what slows. It is what forces the enemy to change his behavior. The anti-tank rifle forced such changes. Perhaps not everywhere. Perhaps not always. But enough that German troops could not simply pretend it was harmless. Enough that Soviet soldiers continued to use it where its strength still applied. Enough that its story remains worth telling not as legend, but as evidence of how war reduces theory to contact. A weapon can be mocked from a distance. It feels different when its round cracks against your vehicle and the track begins to drag. And that returns us to the road west of Moscow, to the cold morning, to the rifleman lying low while the German engine noise grows larger. The moment is small compared to the scale of the war. No grand map turns on that single shot. No capital falls because one track breaks. But war is built from such moments. A man waits. A machine advances. A belief approaches reality. Then the shot comes. And reality answers in metal. The track, the rifle, and the truth. By the time the firing stopped, the road no longer looked like a road. It was a strip of churned snow, torn earth, oil stains, shell holes, and metal fragments. The clean line from the map had disappeared under the weight of what men and machines had done to it. Somewhere near the edge, half buried in dirty snow, there might have been an empty 14.5mm cartridge case. Brass darkened by powder. Warm once, cold now. The rifleman who fired it may have moved. He may have been wounded. He may have died before anyone wrote down what he had done. He may have survived the day and forgotten the exact time of the shot, remembering instead the sound of the track, the recoil in his shoulder, the assistant's hand near the ammunition, the sudden violence of return fire. History often asks weapons to be one thing, successful or failed, modern or obsolete, powerful or weak, feared or mocked. War is rarely so neat. The Soviet anti-tank rifle was limited, could be heavy, awkward, and dangerous to use. It became less effective against heavier armor as the war changed. It did not replace anti-tank guns. It did not grant infantry magical power over German tanks. Many rounds failed. Many teams died. Many German vehicles kept moving. All of that is true. And still, the rifle mattered. It mattered because it existed in the hands of men who needed something. It mattered because tanks depended on more than armor. It mattered because tracks break, optics crack, drivers hesitate, columns bunch, repair crews expose themselves, and a stopped vehicle can alter the rhythm of an attack. It mattered because a weapon does not have to be perfect to be dangerous in the right place. German soldiers had believed that anti-tank rifles were becoming relics, too small to shape the movement of modern armor. Their belief was not absurd. It was based on real changes in armored warfare. But what they did not fully see was that the Eastern Front did not ask only whether a rifle could pierce the strongest plate on a tank. It asked whether that rifle could damage the fragile parts that allowed the tank to remain part of an attack. What they believed was that armor had outgrown the rifle. What really happened was that the rifle found the places armor could not fully protect. There is no need to turn the men who carried these weapons into legends. They were cold, tired, frightened, and often anonymous. They used what they had because the situation demanded it. Their courage was not theatrical. It was practical. It was the courage of waiting too close, firing once, and knowing that the enemy now knew where to look. In the end, the anti-tank rifle story is not about a weapon defeating a tank in the simple way people expect. It is about a smaller truth and perhaps a more important one. War is not only decided by the strongest machines. It is decided by whether those machines can keep moving when the ground, the weather, the enemy, and their own fragile parts begin to turn against them. On that frozen road, the rifle did not need to make the tank explode. It only had to break the track. And for a few hard minutes, that was enough. Final CTA. If you are watching from a place connected to this history, Europe, Russia, America, or anywhere touched by the memory of the Second World War, leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served, endured, repaired, carried, treated the wounded, or simply survived those years, you are welcome to share their story below. Warfront Archive exists to remember the moments that official histories often compress into a single line. If you want more stories about what they believed and what really happened, subscribe and stay with us for the next forgotten battlefield truth.